Greetings, everyone. Welcome, welcome, welcome. I am so glad you are here. Thanks for tuning in. Tonight, we'll be reading chapters 16 and 17 of The American Slave Coast, A History of Slave Breeding Industry in the United States by Ned and Constance Subletti. We're on chapter 16, which starts off Savannah and Stono with a quote from Alexander Hewitt, written in 1779. As the staples of Carolina were valuable and in much demand, credit was extended to that province almost without limitation, and vast multitudes of Negroes and goods of all kinds were sent yearly to it. In proportion as the merchants of Charleston received credit from England, they were enabled to extend it to the planters in the country, who purchased slaves with great eagerness and enlarged their culture. And it has a second quote here, written by James Oglethorpe to the Treasury, to the trustees in January 17th, 1738 or 39, saying, "If we allow slaves, we act against the very principles by which we associated together, which was to relieve the distressed. Whereas now we should occasion the misery of thousands in Africa by setting men upon using arts to buy and bring into perpetual slavery the poor people who now live free there." So basically, what these people were saying is that they were eagerly buying slaves. That's what Alexander Hewitt is talking about. And James Oglethorpe actually had some level of conscience because he was saying that if we do what we plan on doing with slavery, then we're going to bring misery upon thousands of the people in Africa that now live there free. I'll be back in a moment.
Greetings. My name is the Revolutionary Matron, and my show is called The Learning Curve. I broadcast on a network called KWAZ Radio. There are other hosts on the network I'd like you to meet.
Greetings, everyone. This is Koku from the Bitter Medicine Podcast, inviting you to tune in to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio.
Peace, family. This is Oni, inviting you to listen to the Pro-Black Perspective, where black problems are addressed with black solutions.
This is D Webb with the Harsh Reality Podcast, asking you to tune in where we tackle the news of the day that affects our community, only on KWAZ Radio.
The views, thoughts, and opinions expressed here belong solely to the respondent, and they do not necessarily reflect any broadcast networks, affiliates, nor sponsors. The Learning Curve is a broadcast created for the benefit of my global community. Black is a consciousness. Content is being used for our commentary, research, criticism, education, scholarship, teaching, preaching, and news reporting. No copyright infringement is intended. I will make enunciation mistakes. I will give you my opinion about the information. And if you ever ask, I will send you my source.
London newspapers hailed the initiative to found Georgia. It was the product of humanistic and philanthropic movements in London and also of public relations. The colony's visionary founder, James Oglethorpe, spent 2 years directing the colony's promotional campaign before sailing for America. Oglethorpe was an aristocrat, formerly allied with the Stuarts. He had studied classical antiquity at Oxford's Corpus Christi College, then went to the military school in Paris and fought against the Turks in the 1717 siege of Belgrade. Becoming radicalized after his scholar friend Robert Castell died in debtor's prison, Oglethorpe wanted to help the poor better themselves in the autocratic militarized utopia he would build. Georgia was intended to be the site of relief where debtors could have a fresh start, though in practice, no debtors were among the colonists. While functioning as the avant-garde of England's North American empire, protecting South Carolina from Florida. Drawing his studies of Greece and Rome, Oglethorpe devised a unique plan for the city, a matrix of connected rectangular plazas. 24 were built, each one serving as a commons around which were to be housed 10 families, with garden plots for subsistence located within walking distance. Because of that plan, and with help from the lush vegetation, historic Savannah today is one of the most beautiful urban environments in the United States. The colonists carved out their plots from a densely wooded area on a bluff overlooking the Savannah River, beginning the construction of Oglethorpe's meticulously planned community of 240 freeholders. He also founded several other communities in Georgia, namely Darien, Frederica, James Brown's future hometown of Augusta on the Carolina border, and Ebenezer, a community of persecuted Protestants from Salzburg who were dead set against slavery. A group of 41 Jews, all but 7 of them Sephardic Portuguese, arrived on July 11, 1733, and founded a short-lived congregation in 1735. So see, the Jews were there. After checking with the lawyers in Charlestown as to whether Jews could be admitted to Georgia, Oglethorpe was advised that they could be since they weren't papists. Their arrival upset the trustees in London, but they were powerless to do anything about it. Oglethorpe, who had been deputy governor of the Royal African Company, saw slavery as a bad system that would lead to problems in Georgia, and not only because the ever-present potential for rebellion was aggravated by St. Augustine's offer of freedom directly to the South, he also saw it as a corrupting influence on white colonists. Oglethorpe felt the same way about rum prohibiting its sale, though wine and beer were permitted. Nor did he want a real estate market. In Oglethorpe's Georgia, land given to colonists was passed on by entail. It could not be sold, only inherited, and only by men. As the first houses of Savannah were being built and moved into, Oglethorpe lived in a tent to set an example of self-sacrifice for the others. But there was trouble from the beginning, and in an isolated community, riven by vicious personal rivalries and much disagreement, slavery was a divisive issue because many of them saw slavery as a way to earn wealth quickly. Charlestown did more to destroy Oglethorpe's utopia than Florida. Carolina merchants ran trade routes all through the area, and Savannah was dependent upon them for many kinds of supplies. But Oglethorpe didn't want his colony buying supplies from the Carolinians. Most wanted to sell slaves. Moreover, Georgia's resistance to rum impeded Carolinians' business of selling it to the Native Americans along with the guns and ammunitions they were selling them, which created friction. As slave owners would do more than a century later in Missouri and Kansas, and even and would even attempt to do in Southern California, the Southern Carolinians infiltrated pro-slavery colonists into Georgia. So they, like the way that they moved people that would vote for Trump around the country, they did that same thing back then, so that pro-slavery paraphernalia and propaganda would begin to spread around the colonies. The Carolinians who moved down into Georgia had no more respect for Oglethorpe's restriction than they previously had for the Lord proprietors. From South Carolina, Eliza Lucas Pinckney complained in a September 1741 letter of Oglethorpe's tyrannical government in Georgia, presumably because its residents were denied rum and the freedom to buy or own slaves, plant large plantations with staple monocrops, or buy and sell land. Noting this ill treatment of indentured servants in Savannah had caused some to desert, colonist Thomas Jones wrote, "The Carolina temper of procuring slaves and treating them with barbarity seems to be very prevalent among us." Charlestown merchants thus began making money importing Africans from British slave traders for re-export to Georgia, a market that would keep them rich for generations. Prosperity reigned. In 1732, the year Georgia was planted, Benjamin Franklin's ex-apprentice, whose name was Lewis Timothy, founded the South Carolina Gazette, with Franklin as a silent partner. The South's second newspaper to appear, it was as strategic a media rollout as the times afforded. South Carolina's economy, heavily centralized in Charlestown, was booming. By 1735, Charlestown was sufficiently wealthy and cultured to found the St. Cecilia Concert Society. Its fast-growing, wealthy elite consumed luxury products. It was the prime underserved advertising market. Excuse me. Meanwhile, another migration to North America was picking up, the so-called Scottish Irish. The Presbyterianism made them a dissenting sect in Anglican Ulster. They had to settle to the west because the good coastal land was taken. After the first such colony moved to South Carolina to receive land grants near Santee River, establishing Williamsburg in 1732, they were in low and miserable circumstances, wrote Alexander Hewitt, until they too brought slaves from Charlestown merchants and their lands. In the process of time, became moderate and fruitful estates. Greetings, Bwana Haguziki. I thank you so much for all of your donations and contributions. I appreciate you. We're on page 179 of the text. The border was still dangerous. Having Georgia as a buffer between South Carolina and Florida made Carolina that much more secure. But England and Spain were still facing off in the region. The Spanish responded by inducing more of the English colonists' slaves to escape. So Spain was working with the enslaved people, but not because they liked them, but because it was a thorn in England's side and they were at war with England. There were already many communities of free blacks around St. Augustine, but in October 1733, a Spanish edict reiterated that people reaching Florida and accepting the Catholic faith would be free, increasing the flow of runaways. To further bedevil the Carolinians, a free black garrison town called Gracia Real de Santa Teresa de Mos was established in 1738, about 2 miles north of St. Augustine. providing a first line of defense for the Spanish. Its governor was Francisco Menendez, the leader of Florida's black militia, a Mandinga who was born a Muslim. Menendez had been kidnapped to Barbados as a boy and then taken to South Carolina. He defected to the Yamasee Indians at the time of the Yamasee War in 1715 and ultimately escaped to Florida, where he accepted Catholicism and was baptized with his Spanish name. There was a price on his head in South Carolina, but no matter, he was fighting for the Spanish and he had weapons. The news traveled, a free black town on the side of the Spanish with Bakongo soldiers among its residents within marching distance. In 1738, the Spanish at St. Augustine announced that runaways would be given freedom and land, sweetening the attraction the Florida Territory already had for Carolina slaves. Benjamin Franklin's Pennsylvania Gazette, with its good contacts in South Carolina, ran the following item on October 8, 1739. Extract from a letter from South Carolina, Charlestown. The Spaniards of St. Augustine near Georgia have issued a proclamation giving freedom to all white servants and Negro or Indian slaves belonging to Carolina, Harrisburg, or Georgia that will go over to them, and have allotted them land near St. Augustine, where upwards to 700 have been received, to the great loss of the planters, whose parts, which will prove their ruin if a stop is not put to such villainous proceedings. This is a certain proof of their intent to attack Georgia, in which case these servants and slaves are to be their pilots and our worst enemies. They feared uprising had already happened, but word of it hadn't reached Philadelphia yet. Remembered as the Stono Rebellion, it erupted about 20 miles from Charlestown on September 9th, 1739. The anonymous sole first-hand description of the event is not too long to reproduce in its entirety. An account of the Negro insurrection in South Carolina. Sometime since there was a proclamation published in Augustine in which the King of Spain, then at peace with Great Britain, promised protection and freedom to all Negro slaves that would resort thither. Certain Negroes belonging to Captain Davis escaped to Augustine and were received there. They were demanded by General Oglethorpe, who sent Lieutenant Demire to Augustine, and the governor assured the general of his sincere friendship, but at the same time showed his orders from the court of Spain by which he was to receive all runaway Negroes. Of this, other Negroes having notice, as it is believed, from the Spanish emissaries, 4 or 5 who were cattle hunters and knew the woods, some of whom belonged to Captain McPherson, ran away with his horses, wounded his son, and killed another man. These marched for Georgia and were pursued, but the Rangers, being then newly reduced, the country people could not overtake them, though they were discovered by the Salzburgers, the Jews, as they passed by Ebenezer. They reached Augustine, one only being killed and another wounded by the Indians in their flight. They were received there with great honors. One of them had a commission to give him and a coat faced with velvet. Amongst the Negro slaves, there are people brought from the kingdom of Angola in Africa. Many of these speak Portuguese, which language is as near Spanish or Scotch is as Scotch is to English. By reason that the Portuguese have considerable settlement and the Jesuits have a mission and school in that kingdom, and many thousands of Negroes there profess the Roman Catholic religion. Several Spaniards, upon diverse pretenses, have for some time passed between strolling about Carolina. Two of them, who will give no account for themselves, have been taken up and committed to jail in Georgia. The good reception of Negroes at St. Augustine was spread about. Several attempted to escape to the Spaniards and were taken. One of them was hanged in Charlestown. In the latter end of July last, Don Pedro, colonel of the Spanish horse, went in a launch to Charlestown under the pretense of taking a message to General Oglethorpe and the lieutenant governor. On the 9th day of September last, being a Sunday, which is the day the planters allowed them to work for themselves, some Angola Negroes assembled, the number of 20, and one who was called Jimmy as their captain. They surprised a warehouse belonging to Mr. Hutchinson at a place called Stono. They there killed Mr. Robert Bathurst and Mr. Gibbs, plundered the house, and took a pretty many small arms and powder which were there for sale. Next, they plundered and burnt Mr. Godfrey's house and killed him and his daughter and son. They then turned back and marched southward along Ponds, which is the road through Georgia to Augustine. They passed Mr. Wallace's tavern towards daybreak, and they said they would not hurt him, for he was a good man and kind to his slaves. But they broke open and plundered Mr. Lemmy's house and killed him, his wife, and child. They marched on towards Mr. Rose's, resolving to kill him, but he was saved by a Negro who, having hid him, went out and pacified the others. You see how they had sellouts even at that time? Several Negroes joined them, they calling out liberty, marching on with colors displayed and 2 drums beating, pursuing all the white people they met with and killing man, woman, and child when they could come upon them. Colonel Bull, lieutenant governor of South Carolina, who was then riding along the road, discovered them, was pursued, and with much difficulty he escaped and raised the countrymen. They burnt Colonel Heck's house and killed his overseer and his wife. Then they burnt Mr. Spry's house, then Mr. Chavarel's house, then Mr. Nash's house, all lying upon the Ponds Road, and they killed all the white people they found in them. Mr. Bullock got off, but they burnt his house. By this time, many of them were drunk with the rum they had taken in the houses. They increased every minute by new Negroes coming to them, so that they were above 60, some say above 100, on which they halted in a field and set to dancing, singing, and beating drums to draw more Negroes to them, thinking that they were victorious over the whole province, having marched 10 miles and burnt all before them without opposition. But the militia was being raised, and the planters with great briskness pursued them, and when they came up, dismounting, charged them on foot. The Negroes were soon routed, though they behaved boldly, several being killed on the spot. Many ran back to their plantations, thinking they had not been missed, but they were then and there taken and shot. Such as were taken in the field so also were, after being examined, shot on the spot. And this is to be said to the honor of the Carolina planters, that notwithstanding the provocation they had received from so many murders, they did not torture one Negro, but only put them to an easy death. All they proved to be forced and were not concerned in the murders and burnings were pardoned. And this sudden courage in the field and the humanity afterward hath also good an effect, that there had been no further attempt, and that the very spirit of revolt seems over. About 30 escaped from flight, of which 10 marched about 30 miles southward, and being overtaken by the planters on horseback, fought stoutly for some time and were all killed on the spot. The rest are yet untaken. In the whole action, about 40 Negroes and 20 whites were killed. The lieutenant governor sent an account of this to General Oglethorpe, who met the advices on his return from the Indian nation. He immediately ordered a troop of rangers to be tangled and ranged to patrol through Georgia, placed some men in the garrison at Palahochas, which was before abandoned, and near which the Negroes formerly passed, being the only place here where horses can come and swim over the river Savannah for nearly 100 miles. He ordered out the Indians in pursuit of a detachment of the garrison at Port Royal to assist the planters on any occasion, and published the proclamation ordering all the constables and officers of Georgia to pursue and seize all Negroes with a reward for any that could be taken. It is hoped these measures will prevent any Negroes from getting down to the Spaniards. A brief account of the uprising in the Pennsylvania Gazette on November 8th read, "We hear that Charlestown in South Carolina, that a body of Angolan Negroes rose upon the county lately, plundered stores at Stono of a quantity of arms and ammunition, and murdered 21 white men, women, and children before they were suppressed. That 47 of the rebels were executed, some gibbeted, and the heads of others fixed on poles in different parts for a terror to the rest." John Thornton underscores the probable military background of the so-called Angolan Negroes. They were likely not Kimbundu-speaking Angolans. Relatively few of them came to North America, but their immediate neighbors to the north, who were Bakongo. The term Angola, Thornton writes, surely meant the general stretch of Africa known to English shippers as the Angola coast, though the possibility exists that some people from various Central African regions and origins were mixed in. In a world divided by religion, that these Africans were Catholic made them instant allies of the Spanish. As the slave trade created business opportunities in Africa, African despots formed regularly organized armies and battled each other, the losers being sold into slavery. So this is what they mean when they tell you you just lost the war. The result was that the ranks of the enslaved in the Americas included increasing numbers of combat-seasoned veterans of gun-toting African armies. In her History of Congo Catholicism, Cecile Froment identifies the ceremony that preceded the Stono uprising as a typical African sagamento, a martial performance in preparation for battle, in a manner similar to that used by contemporary Congo armies. The mention of drums and singing ties the Stono rebellion in with later rebellions, as well as with Congo military and spiritual influence. and Saint Domingue and Cuba. African drums were a means of military communication, as the British well understood. Since 1699, the law in Barbados has stipulated that whatsoever master shall suffer his Negro or slave at any time to beat drums, blow horns, or use any other loud instruments, or shall not cause his Negro houses once a week to be searched, and if any such things be found there to be burnt, he shall forfeit 40 shillings sterling. So as you can see, the whole perspective here was that they didn't want any of our instruments of warfare to be in our houses in Barbados. They took the drum, the horn, they took our ability to communicate across distances with each other. The South Carolina Gazette ran no articles about the Stono uprising, apparently fearing even to mention the subject where the Black majority might learn of it. But a Charlestown merchant wrote in a letter of December 27th of that year that we shall live very uneasy with our Negroes while the Spaniards continue to keep possession of St. Augustine. For several years after the Stono Rebellion, writes Peter H. Wood, the safety of the white minority and the viability of their entire plantation system hung in serious doubt. Because once we know we can rebel and we can overthrow them, then all of us will rebel and overthrow them. That's why Burkina Faso is so important in modern times. Believing foreign slaves to be the most dangerous, South Carolina raised the duty on slave importation from 10 pounds to a prohibitive 50. But that made for considerable lost income for local government in a territory where slaves accounted for 2/3 of customs revenues from 1731. So, in 1744, the duty was lowered back to its previous level. Previously, South Carolina had imposed double duties on slaves not coming from Africa, apparently in order to discourage the unloading of incorrigible West Indian slaves into their territory. The author of an 1825 pro-slavery pamphlet in Charlestown noted that the Stono Rebellion was also remembered as the Gullah War. In recent years, Y.N. Cly has been arguing for the use of the term Gullah War as a blanket name for the ongoing Black resistance struggle in South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida that lasted from Stono until 1858, with the end of what is usually called the Third Seminole War. The Gullah War can be seen as part of a larger war against slavery, fought in ways large and small by the enslaved. From this perspective, slave rebellions reveal themselves not to be isolated struggles as they had been frequently characterized, but rather as eruptions of a widespread, ongoing state of resistance. Their tactics ranged from day-to-day resistance to absconding to full-out uprising to actions taken by the enslaved in major wars. In the wake of Stono, the South Carolina legislature on May 10, 1740, passed a detailed new slave code, an act for the better ordering and governing of Negroes and other slaves in this province, or more simply put, the Negro Act, had been long in preparation, but some had thought it severe. Its passage was catalyzed by the crisis atmosphere. Under its regulations, teaching a slave to write became a punishable fine by punishable by a fine of 100 pounds, masters had to apply the legislature for permission to manumit, and it even forbade slave owners to allow their slaves to dress in clothes much above the condition of slaves. Aimed at making impossible the kinds of public assemblies that could turn into mobs or hatch conspiracies, Article 36 out of 58 paraphrased the existing Barbadian regulation to stipulate that whatsoever master, owner, or overseer shall permit or suffer his Negroes or their Negro or other slave or slaves at any time hereafter to beat drums, blow horns, or use any other loud instrument, or whatsoever or whosoever shall suffer the countenance any public meeting or feastings of strange Negroes or slaves on their plantations shall forfeit 10 pounds current money for every such offense. One long-term consequence of this and similar legislation was that African hand drums, so rigorously prohibited by the British colonists, do not turn up in popular African music until they came to the United States by the Cubans in the mid-20th century. The African drums were played on some of the southern plantations as documented, but they do not seem to have flourished outside their immediate context. Another clause of the Negro Act forbade slaves from engaging in sales, and yet another restricted gatherings of great numbers of Negroes, both in town and country, at their burials and on the Sabbath day. All this was in marked contradistinction to New Orleans, where Sunday gatherings were already taking place in the Commons, later known as Congo Square. The Negro Act was not discussed in the South Carolina Gazette. Days after the legislature adjourned, a slave conspiracy was uncovered, or perhaps imagined, in June 1740 among plantation slaves planning to strike in some numbers against Charlestown. The undoing of that conspiracy, also unreported in the Gazette, though other colonial newspapers took up the slack, resulted in the hanging of 50 people in daily batches of 10. The following year, after a purportedly murderous slave conspiracy was uncovered in New York, the second largest Black city after Charlestown, Magistrate Daniel Hordsman executed and exiled over 100 people. Horseman, who may have dramatically exaggerated an existing plot or may have even imagined it all, linked the never realized Black insurrection to an alleged Catholic plot involving the Spanish. Between 1730 and 1760, there were 29 slave revolts reported in North America, about one plot a year, with an unknown number of others of smaller dimensions going underreported. When a calamitous fire in Charlestown on November 18, 1740, in a very short time laid the fairest and richest part of the town in ashes and consumed the most valuable effects of the merchants and inhabitants. It was said at first that the fire had been set by slaves, though this apparently was not true. The clergyman Josiah Smith preached a sermon, subsequently published with the title, The Burning of Sodom, that spoke of the fire as God's punishment for wickedness. Smith excoriated the whites of the town for defiling themselves by having sex with their slaves. not because they were taking unfair advantage of their captives, but because they were cohabitating with inferiors. Reverend Josiah Smith insisted there was a great deal of fornication going on by saying, there has been too much affinity in our sins and those of Sodom as there has been in our punishment. Whether we have any Sodomites in our town, strictly so, I can't say. Such abandoned wretches generally curse the sun and hate the light, lest their deeds should be reproved. But in some respects and instances, we declare our sin as Sodom. We hide it not. We have proclaimed on the housetop what we should be ashamed of in secret. Let us inquire seriously whether our filthiness not be found in our skirts, whether our streets, lanes, and houses did not burn with lust before they were consumed with fire. That unnatural practice of some debauchees, that mixing and production, meaning having offspring, doubly spurious of black and white, and taking those to our bed and arms, whom at another time we set with the dogs of our flock, ought to stand in the red capitals among our crying abominations. I know not if Sodom had done this. The news of Stono arrived in Georgia concurrently with the confirmation that, as rumored, England and Spain were yet at war again. It was especially unhappy news because the tensions among the disputed Georgia-Florida border had been the catalyst for the hostilities. Britain's enduring disingenuous name for the resulting war was applied to it much after the fact. In 1858, by Thomas Carlyle, the War of Jenkins' Ear. This referred to an incident that occurred off the coast of Florida in 1731, 8 years before the war began. A Spanish Coast Guard patrol boat from St. Augustine boarded a British brig, during which action the Spanish officer Juan de Leon Fandino cut off the ear of the British captain Thomas Jenkins, taking in vain the name of the British king as he did so. The pickled ear was subsequently exhibited on the floor of Parliament. Remembering the conflict as the War of Jenkins' Ear might suggest that the war was somehow trivial or silly. In Spain, however, the war was remembered not but by the anecdotal incident, but by its underlying financial cause, the Guerrero del Ascenso. British merchants commonly used their slave shipments to the Spanish colonies as Trojan horses to smuggle all sorts of other goods in. Worse, the British government has stopped making its payments for the Ascenso to Spain as was called for. With England and Spain at war, Oglethorpe led a month-long siege in St. Augustine in 1740, but failed to take it. Its defenders included about 100 black militiamen from Gracia Real del Santa Teresa de Mos, led by Yamasee war veteran Francisco Menendez, who we talked about earlier, who was born Muslim, who was from Bakongo. Meanwhile, a dissident faction in Georgia dubbed the Malcontents were uninterested in small, self-sufficient, and alienable farms. They wanted to get rich via large, debt-driven plantation slavery, and they wanted a functioning real estate market so that they could buy out or seize the farms of others. Oglethorpe thought them in league both with the Charlestown merchants, which they were, and the enemy of St. Augustine, which they may not have been. Oglethorpe wrote the trustees on May 28, 1742, saying, "The mutinous temper at Savannah now shows to itself to be fomented by the Spaniards, and that the destruction of that place was but part of their scheme for raising a general disturbance through all North America. They found three inseparable obstacles in their way in driving out the English from this colony. First, the people being white and Protestant, and no Negroes were naturally attached to the government. Second, the lands being of inheritance, as men could not sell, they would not leave the country so easily as newcomers would do, who could sell their improvements. Thirdly, distilled liquors were prohibited, which made the place healthy. Their partisans labored to get those who perhaps intended no ill to bring about what they desired. First, to obtain Negroes, being secure that slaves would be either recruits to an enemy or plunder them. Secondly, land alienable, which would bring in the stock jobbing temper, the devil take the hindmost. And three, free importation of rum and spirits, which would destroy the troops and laboring people here. The war with Spain made Savannah's Jewish community particularly nervous since they had fled the Inquisition. The community collapsed in 1741, and some of its members relocated to Charlestown, where a congregation was organized in 1749, with the community divided between Portuguese or Sephardic Jews and Ashkenazi or German Jews. Oglethorpe defeated a Spanish invasion of St. Simon's Island in the descriptively named Battle of Bloody Marsh on July 6, 1742, effectively consolidating Britain's ownership of the Spanish-claimed territory of Georgia. The force that attacked St. Simon's Island was a large one, about 1,000 Spanish regulars and 500 or so Black militiamen from Cuba, where a quarter or more of the soldiery was Pardo or mulatto or Moreno, which means black. Alexander Hewitt, a Scottish Presbyterian minister who wrote the first history of South Carolina and Georgia after being expelled from Charlestown as a loyalist in 1777, recalled the frightening impression made by the presence of uniformed Black soldiers. He recalled that among their land forces, they had a fine company of artillery under the command of Don Antonio de Redondo and a regiment of Negroes. The Negro commanders were clothed in lace, bore the same rank with white officers, and with equal freedom and familiarity walked and conversed with the commander-in-chief. Such an example might justly have alarmed Carolina, for should the enemy penetrate into that province where there were such numbers of Negroes, they would soon have acquired such a force as must have rendered all opposition fruitless. The war was mostly over by 1742 after an attempted occupation of Cartagena. By some 30,000 British troops was repulsed. Through hostilities continued through 1748. During the war, Spanish ships, joined in 1741 by French ones, preyed on shipments bringing American tobacco to London, denying the Chesapeake tobacco farmers access to their market in Britain. This further encouraged the farmers in their ongoing switch to wheat, which had a domestic market, took fewer weeks of labor than tobacco, and needed less tending as it grew. Meanwhile, the British were cut off from their supply in the French West Indies, spurring the development of indigo production in South Carolina. The first crop of indigo was brought in 1744, about 5 miles from the site of the Stono Rebellion, by the 21-year-old Eliza Lucas, a true godmother of American slavery. Lucas had lived most of her life in Antigua, where her father was the lieutenant governor. After trying her hand at raising ginger, alfalfa, cotton, and cassava at her father's South Carolina plantations, which she managed in his absence, she found she could grow indigo with seeds of the West Indian variety that her father sent her. But she could not process the plant into dye until her father sent her a Negro man who knew how. After the success of her crop, she distributed seed to her neighbors and married Charles Pinckney of Charlestown, becoming Eliza Lucas Pinckney. Britain paid a bounty for indigo cultivation in order to have a supply of dye for its growing textile manufacturers through the South Carolina product, though the South Carolina product was inferior in quality to the indigo they had been receiving from India. India was the perfect complement to rice. Both called for large amounts of labor, and most importantly, they grew in different seasons, allowing for one overworked labor force to produce 2 different staple crops in a year. Both crops required disagreeable, unhealthy work. Accounts of indigo production describe the terrible stench it gave off as the plants decomposed after infusion. It attracted grasshoppers and clouds of flies, was toxic to the workers, depleted the soil, and ruined the surrounding land for cattle, which were needed to provide basic nourishment for the region. But once processed, it was a perfect long-distance export. A small amount of concentrated solid dye stuff had a high value. It was even more profitable than rice. The success of indigo made South Carolina much more profitable, further stimulating British trade, most especially the slave trade, to the colony. Oglethorpe returned to England for good in 1743, leaving behind William Stevens as governor. Stevens followed Oglethorpe's principles at a tremendous personal cost, since his son Thomas had become leader of the malcontents. But in 1749, he admitted defeat, advising the trustees that the prohibition against slavery was no longer enforceable. Slavery was legalized in Georgia as of January 1st, 1751, and by 1752, the trustees had washed their hands of the place as the territory reverted to crown colonial status. The itinerant traders who brought slaves in from South Carolina became known by a name that would outlive them: Georgia men. 20 years after its founding as the first free soil territory in the nascent British Empire, Georgia was firmly established as a satellite of South Carolina's world of plantation slavery. Though slave owners frequently accused Britain of having forced the system of slavery on them, the case of Georgia offered an unambiguous model of the contrary. The British, who established the colony, wanted no slavery, but some of the colonists and the South Carolina merchants did. And that's the end of our chapter 16. We're going to have to read chapter 17 next week. But as you can see, Georgia was not supposed to be a slave state. Georgia was not supposed to be a slave state. Georgia was supposed to be this utopia where a man could have land. It would be inheritable. He didn't want there to be a real estate market. He just wanted Georgia to be a freehold state where people that were poor in other areas could come and become wealthy or comfortable there. But greed stepped in. And when that greed stepped in and they realized that they can make way more money selling to the traders, they could make way more money having large plantations. They can make way more money if they had the opportunity to sell their land. Then they decided that they needed Georgia to become like South Carolina and to become a slave state. I want to thank Bwana Haguziki for listening with me tonight. I know that Manning for Mayor is listening. I know that the Forecast is listening. I know that Sister Ron, the elders are listening. I know that Anthony McPhail is listening. I know that Koku is listening. I know that John Henry is listening. I know that Nate Waters is listening, and so many others, and you. Yes, you. I appreciate each and every one of you for tuning in, and I will see you on Thursday with Brainwashed. Peace, guys.